Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Gun violence has troubled the US for a long time, more so in recent years. The 10 people killed with 3 others injured make the racially motivated attack in Buffalo, New York, the deadliest mass shooting of the year in the US. It is also the 198th mass shooting so far this year, which averages to about 10 such attacks a week. Last year, nearly 45,000 people were killed due to gun violence, an average of more than 120 victims per day. Debates over stricter gun control laws heat up along with the rise in gun-related crimes. So why is it so hard to control guns in the US? What are really the reasons behind this? Let's loop in our panelists. Welcome to the program. Now joined by Talisa Carter, Assistant Professor in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology with American University, based in Washington, D.C. And I'm also joined in Maryland, Jason Nichols, Senior Lecturer of African American Studies from University of Maryland. Welcome to both of you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, another tragedy. And yet this tragedy is being broadcast live on social media. Tell me more about your reaction, immediate reaction to the latest tragedy, Talisa.
Yeah, so wait, it's a great question. So social media, sometimes when these things happen, it almost bombards you, it takes you over. And you can be scrolling. I remember I was scrolling on my phone, just randomly, mindlessly scrolling, and then immediate trauma. So my first reaction is always again, right? This happened again. And so there's a moment of kind of, you take a pause, everything stops and you want to figure it out, but then there's a hesitation to even click the button. Because even though I study racing crime, these things can really be overwhelming. And so the first thing that actually came up on my feed wasn't just a news announcement about the incident. It was actually the live stream from the shooter. And I chose not to click on that because it's exposing you kind of like to death, right? To murder. And that's never okay. So instead I went around, being from New York myself, I went around, started asking some people what was happening, and eventually I got a news link.
Frustration and helplessness. That's an emotion shared by many when listening to the latest news. But Talisa, how do you understand the repeated cases like this taking place in the US?
So hate crimes, as defined by the FBI, is a criminal offense against person or property when an offender is either partly or wholly motivated in bias, right? Bias can be race, ethnicity, gender, ability issues, right? But in terms of race, we can't kind of decouple that from the history of this nation. So President Biden actually recently said that hate is a stain on the soul of America. Arguably, though, historically, we can argue that it's not a stain because the stain would have come out by now. And that's a big thing. And so we really have to reconcile with what happens in the United States if hate is a part of our fabric. It's a part of our being that we're never actually going to completely dismiss. And that might be bleak for some, right? And so, like you said, frustration, kind of this repeated happening, but we have to really reconcile as a nation where we came from. And that's a task that's not a small one. But kind of when these things happen and we're confronted again and again, and there's trauma again and again, and people show up and they cry at the top of their voices that their lives matter, but they're not seen, they're not heard. When all of that happens, we're left with what, right? To say that this is going to change tomorrow or a bill is going to pass, right, in the House or the Senate, and things are going to be better, right? The Black community in particular, right, considering the history in this country, in the United States, right, it's hard for us to believe that, right? And there's statistics that back that notion. As a criminologist, we would call it racial threat theory, right? But in the manifesto of the shooter, he referred to a different theory, replacement theory is called, where it's this kind of fear or this conspiracy theory that white people will be replaced by non-whites intentionally, right? The white people will lose their place in terms of power and status, right? Being replaced by non-whites in the country. And so we have different theories for it, depending upon discipline. But the idea is that the multiracial kind of stake that America claims is kind of pervaded with hate. And we have to figure that out.
That's a great point, Jason. Not a disdain, but rather in the fabric. That's the argument Talisa made very strongly. Whether it is a disdain, whether it is a fabric, whether we have seen not just cream on the top in terms of solutions, but fundamentally a recognition of the realities and deal with it fundamentally, Jason.
Yes, I think that it is absolutely in our fabric. These incidents usually capture our imagination as a nation. And a lot of times we see the nation even comes together. Like after Charleston, we saw some amount of unity after this, after a tragedy like this. But we go back to who we are as a nation, separate oftentimes divided. And we don't have the fundamental conversation that leads to, these kinds of things bubbling to the surface.
What is the fundamental discussion, Jason, that you refer to?
Well, I think we need to talk about white supremacy and what it means, and how white nationalism, as she referred to with replacement theory, how that is also ingrained in our thinking as a nation. It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how whiteness operates in the United States, but it is something that goes back to at least the mid-19th century. If you look at the know-nothing parties or the know-nothings of the 1850s, they were saying the same thing that replacement theory is saying today. The idea that these people from other places are going to outnumber, the native white population. This is the same nativism we've seen over and over and over again. It, as I said, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how whiteness operates, because when whiteness starts to be threatened to become a minority, it just expands. That's the way it works.
So why do you think, Jason, those fundamental discussions are not taking place?
Well, I think number one, because the status quo is easier. And I think that there are people who benefit from the status quo who are generally in power. And so we don't have the fundamental conversations oftentimes. And it's not actually just the conversation. It's about the action that happens after the conversation. And a lot of these things are hard topics. People don't want to have those kinds of discussions, because then after the discussion, you have to lead towards action. And action is hard. And people don't want to take those kinds of efforts to actually make us a better and more egalitarian society.
I see. Talisa?
I agree with everything that Jason said. I will say that in terms of not having the fundamental conversations or why they're not happening, I think it's because it's easier to blame one person or a few people, right, than systems, right? So what protects whiteness is systems. Right? That's what protects it. It's not about blame. And that's where we get caught in these conversations. Right? So I teach these at a predominantly white institution. I teach these issues, right? And people are receptive to it of all races. It doesn't matter if one is white when it's presented not as blame, but as fact. Right? It's a social fact that systems protect some people, or they take care of, right? Health systems take care of some people or give more people opportunities, education, labor than others. That's a fact, right? And so honestly, individuals are much more open to fact than I think people realize. But institution-wide, it's easier to fire a couple of employees, right? To kind of cancel a couple of cops, to cancel, right? Cancel culture, to cancel a couple of entertainers that step out of line, like that, not in the status quo. That's the easy way. But to blame an institution, to say, for example, that the criminal justice system or higher education or healthcare as a whole is systematically flawed, is a very difficult conversation to have. Right? And especially in a capitalistic society where we are all, including me, right? Including me included, we all need money, right? To kind of sustain ourselves. And so in that way, we are obligated to the same system that oppresses us in these really interesting ways. And so to free ourselves of that, we have to reimagine and act upon that reimagination in a fearless way, right? And that a lot of people do not have the privilege to act upon.
I'm sure that question has been asked many times: where to start with, how to start with, and who will do the job, how to maintain a certain degree that there will be a great systematic changes going on, but at the same time, the society normally move on so that to maintain certain kinds of, how shall I say, sustainable development for most of the population. I think these are, I'm sure, questions being asked and answers to your satisfaction, Talisa?
Yeah, so really great question. So I guess for me, it can't be satisfying because I don't think I'll live to see it, right? To be honest, to live to see kind of this freedom across races, of course, across colors, right? I don't think I'll live to see it. But in terms of kind of hopelessness or feeling like nothing's going to happen, I'm still committed to this cause, right? I feel like change takes time. And particularly for younger generations, that's hard to hear. I can tell it's a hard sell in the classroom that change takes time, but committed to it. So in my classroom, I think that's a first step, right? Exposing people to facts before they even enter a profession.
One could argue, Talisa, both you and Jason are top of the cream of your community, the African-American community. So how to also, Jason, that's another question, to gear up the rest of the community to work in concerted efforts. How to do it today? I think, Jason, that's a thought-provoking question, definitely.
First things that we have to do is acknowledge that there are advantages that put people like me in the position that I'm in within the community. But I think the other thing is to not get satisfied with the fact that, you know, my kids go to good schools and I live in a nice community and I have a backyard that I get to mow and all those kinds of things. One of the things that I have to do is to recognize that I still have a responsibility towards the community and to advocate from the community that I came from. And Talisa and I probably, you know, I was born in Harlem. I'm probably from a community not far from where Dr. Carter's from. I have a responsibility to the people in those communities, to the schools in those communities, to the healthcare environments and all the places where African Americans are facing discrimination, and to use my voice to advocate for that. And that's one of the things that, as Dr. Carter said, that we can do here as our voices are amplified in a media environment, or to go to the meetings and to be in the classroom in front of people who will one day be decision makers and doctors and teachers, to try to advocate for a more egalitarian society. And that's something that I think we can do. And I think that there are many of us who honestly moved out to the suburbs and forgot where we came from and didn't continue to advocate for our communities.
I really want to thank you for your sincerity. I think I see the beautiful hearts of both of yours in this conversation, for real. My final question is the role of politics, very important in pushing forward our agenda. But at the same time, these issues are much more important than just the politics, to make sure they are not being shaped by politics. So how to understand that very important relationship?
Politics is so powerful, right? But you're right, absolutely, Wei, that kind of politics can shape these issues, and it can be cyclical, right? They shape each other. So in terms of people on the ground, social science finds is that a lot of times people just believe the people they trust, right? And so if your state thinks it, you think it oftentimes, right? If your teacher says something, you believe your teacher, right? So people are deferring kind of their knowledge to people or places they think have that covered, or experts. And while that can be great, knowledge is not always kind of true, right? What's spread is not always factual, right? And so disinformation has really come to the forefront as well, particularly on social media. And so what we see is that people are deferring expertise to people who are not experts, right? People are forming and kind of getting facts from things that aren't factual. And so the tension here is kind of how to get people to equip people who maybe never went to college, right? Who kind of don't watch the news, right? Who maybe are working 3 jobs and just really the only information they have time for is from their family, their friends, their loved ones on social media. And so what do we do to contend with that? People have to trust themselves. right? They have to do the work, and that takes time, and time is a privilege. And so connected to what Jason just said, right, we have to remember that not everybody has, even though it might seem like in the 21st century, everybody has kind of access to knowledge and research and Google and this and that. Actually, that's not true, right? To have the time to go down these rabbit holes and to figure out what on your Facebook feed is true or not, what on your Twitter feed is true or not, people don't do that. And so I think really what's critical, right, in terms of politics and what's shaping is that people continue to shape society instead of the other way around. And they have to trust themselves. Right? And that takes time, it takes education, right? And it takes education outside of the ivory tower that Jason and I work in. It takes education on the ground. It takes people going back and saying, are you reading this? Have you heard this? What do you know? Challenging people's assumptions. That's what it takes. It takes time.
Don't try to walk around it or hide from it. It's a reality. Talk about the reality in the most reasonable way. Thank you so much, Talisa Carter and Jason Nichols. Appreciate it.